amendments and schedules and new schedules. The question is that Part 2 stand part. I call on Simon Court.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We've previously covered off the intention of the intensified streamlined planning process earlier this morning. And what's clear is that local government has struggled in some of the Tier 1 cities to identify land where intensification is suitable, negotiate that with communities through existing planning provisions under the RMA, and then deliver back to those communities a plan which sets out where it is suitable to build, to intensify. Some councils, like Auckland and like Hamilton, for example, have been through extensive processes where they've taken many factors into account. And the Auckland Unitary Plan is a classic example of where many different competing and conflicting values and objectives are consulted on widely, and I'll come back to that, consulted on widely. The communities, those affected, whether they be businesses, whether they be professionals, people who have direct experience in subdivision, in establishing the infrastructure needed to service land, whether they be urban design professionals, architects. And I'm still at a loss to understand how, as an engineer who's come to Parliament, I find myself here today having to stand up for the rights of architects to design good homes. Because I thought all of those discussions had been had. I thought that there were already well understood urban design principles about outlook, sunlight, outdoor space, and access to amenities, and that we shouldn't need to be relitigating those in the schedules in Part 2, and we certainly shouldn't be essentially carrying out urban design exercises either in primary legislation by select committee or in committee of the whole House. Parliament's job should never be to carry out urban design exercises. But that is what the schedules essentially provide for, with the design criteria for the medium density residential standard. And the way that that design criteria, the way that the standard is delivered is through the intensified streamlined planning process. Quite a few councils and developers, those people who actually use the RMA, and their planning professionals, the consultants who help them navigate their way through legislation, through planning law, they pointed out that actually it would be helpful to have a streamlined planning process for a whole range of things. We know that Kāinga Ora operates a streamlined planning process, except it doesn't seem they want to do that for the private sector. We know that there's a fast-track consenting process for COVID-19 projects, some of which may or may not be related to COVID-19 and may or may not actually deliver homes or jobs or anything else either. But this process here actually sets out how councils and hearings panels are supposed to carry out their work. And it would be fair to say that without offering a similar process to the private sector developers who are bringing on tens of thousands of homes, some of them, like the Templeton Group, pointed out that they've got $8 billion worth of work in the pipeline. They pointed out that any delays to the process they use under the Resource Management Act typically cost about $1 million a year. That's the overhead just to have the project sitting, waiting to get into the Environment Court, waiting for a decision. They said that some of their projects have spent 7 to 8 years going through the planning process, going to appeal, and then going to various courts, including the High Court and above, to seek direction and essentially to have decisions made about very basic elements of town planning, and where houses, where buildings, where streets should go. And what they're asking for is to have the same rights that every other council will have, which is to have access to the intensified streamlined planning process. In fact, any streamlined planning process that enables them to seek consents under the Resource Management Act or subsequent... Madam Chair. Madam Chair. So,
call on Simon Court.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the question is, will the government consider actually allowing private developers to have access to the same process? And if not, is it because the Minister and the Labour Party and the National Party that crafted this bill actually believe that all solutions when it comes to housing intensity, actually sit with government or local government? Because most New Zealanders would actually believe that government is the problem when it comes to getting things built. It's regulations, it's red tape, it's how difficult it is to get consent even for things like desperately needed wastewater system upgrades in places like Queenstown on the shores of Lake Wakatipu, where it's been so difficult to install wastewater pumping stations that the councils had to go and apply for consent to continue wastewater discharges into that lake because it's too hard to get consent to build the wastewater treatment station that they want to. And so they're in breach of consents. So an intensified, streamlined planning process is a good idea in principle, but limiting it only to local councils and to plans made specifically to implement the medium density residential standard seems not just short-sighted, but lacking an aspiration for a wholesale and complete reform of the planning process. We've heard recently in Select Committee that may well be the intention of the Minister's other legislation, the Natural and Built Environments Bill and maybe a Strategic Planning Act. We often hear these things referred to. They are some kind of promised land of planning and environmental management and urban development. And yet, despite the fact that the promised land is not too far away, and while we're all paddling our walkers there, spending hundreds and hundreds of hours in Select Committee collecting thousands of submissions on that particular piece of legislation intending to reform planning and enable housing and save the environment and save a whole lot of other things at the same time, this bill was being crafted in secret over months and months and months while the Select Committee sat reviewing another piece of resource management legislation. And many of the same questions that developers brought and councils even brought, planning professionals brought to the committee, asked the same question. Why can the private sector not have access to a fast-track development process? Why are they subject to objections from organisations like Greenpeace, for example, and others who are given standing to object against what essentially are developments that deliver homes and communities and infrastructure to the people of New Zealand? So some of these fundamental issues about who has standing, who should be allowed to object, are not addressed in terms of the fundamental problems with the RMA. The ability to consent infrastructure to actually service the land that this upzoning provided for by the medium density residential standard, those matters are not dealt with. There was an opportunity to actually reform the RMA on the run while more stuff is done down the track, like the Natural and Built Environments Bill. The ACT Party and other parties and developers, submitters, have all said that they want an opportunity to contribute, but there was no opportunity for consultation on this piece of legislation. There may have been a lot more easy wins in terms of intensified, streamlined planning processes than actually that have been delivered to the House in this bill. And that comes back to the secrecy element, the fact that it was essentially cooked up over a number of months without the knowledge of the development community, the planning community, all of those professional engineers and architects and ecologists, geotechnical specialists who could have given advice to the government and to officials on what a good short-term reform measure looked like. They weren't consulted. So now we have an intensified, streamlined planning process which only gives these rights to councils. So what I'm asking the Minister is to please explain, why is this not being extended to the private sector? Why was consultation on this process not carried out with the private sector and councils for that matter? And what is his plan to actually speed up planning to get more houses built?
I call on the Minister, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's a lot of questions raised in that contribution, and I'll try to address them. Can I thank the member for the opening few sentences of that contribution, where he said to the House that councils in our largest growing cities have often found it hard to zone for intensity. And that's a simple truth. It's a self-evident truth, actually, and it's not the only problem why we've got such high land price inflation, but it is a contributing factor to it. This bill applies to the Tier 1 councils. There's 5 of them, and on if there's the occasional Tier 2 council that needs it, we can bring them in, and Tier 3 councils can also try and volunteer in if they want to, and some have said they want to. The Tier 1 councils are Auckland, Greater Hamilton, Greater Tauranga, Greater Wellington and Greater Christchurch. In total, the territorial authorities that cover those areas, there's 12 of them. And when it came to bringing this to the attention of each of those territorial authorities, the Honourable Megan Woods, as Housing Minister, and I, as Environment Minister, split into 2 and phoned 6 of the mayors each. We then touched base with each other after we'd done it. Both of us had 4 mayors who were very, very positive about this, because they recognise they need help to break through and what they need to do for their citizens. And these mayors want to do the right things for their citizens. They want them to have housing choices. They don't want rents to go too high. They don't want house prices to go too high. And they know, to use the language of the leader of the ACT Party, that it is actually the marginal cost of new supply that drives price, and it flows through to the. It is the marginal cost of the new house, including its land and its building, that drives the cost, obviously, of the new house, but it also drives the market for second-hand houses, and therefore the increment to supply that you can bring about by enabling the land that's already within a city to be used more intensively, really the efficiency that you have from land use and infrastructure use drives through to the marginal cost of the new supply, which drives through to the price of all housing. And these mayors get that. They got that. And so 4 out of the 6 that I phoned were very, very positive. One of them was neutral and one was a bit anti. And the experience of Minister Woods was the same. She had 4 that were effusive, really. 1 who was sitting on the fence and 1 that wasn't so keen. So in respect of some of the issues that have, other issues that were raised, this isn't the sole answer to the housing crisis. And there are other things in responding to the housing crisis that are going well. House building in Auckland has doubled from 10,000 in 2017 to 19,000 this year. It's close to a doubling of housing, and it's very interesting that more than 2/3 of those new houses are actually these new style of houses where they're effectively semi-detached or attached 3-storey houses. So that gives us confidence that we're on the right track. In respect of the private plan changes point, planning rules, by and large, in respect of zoning rules, are the primary preserve of councils. That's what they're elected to do, which is a point that has been made by, amongst others, the ACT Party in this debate. So we think it is appropriate that they're the people to whom this is primarily delivered through. But of course, the zoning rules that they allow in these cities apply for the benefit of all of the private developers, and the vast majority of the development on those enabled by these changes to the planning rules will be by those private developers. In respect of the process delays that Simon Court mentioned in terms of how long it can take a plan to proceed at the moment. I agree that that is unacceptable. This will actually assist in that because we're actually going to make three-story types of dwellings. We're going to make that, we're going to permit that as a building type through virtually all of these cities. There are some exceptions that we've previously talked about. In terms of the process, actually you couldn't do it any faster than we're actually legislating it for this, but it does show the tension between some of the traditional processes which take too long. In the face of, Madam Chair,
I call on the Minister.
In the face of a crisis, you do have to act quickly, and we think this is appropriate.
I call on the Honourable Eugenie Sage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in the whole intensification streamlined planning process, one of the recommendations of the Select Committee, which has been picked up in the Minister's supplementary order paper, is that the scope of the intensification planning instruments be broadened to enable provision of papakainga. And recognising that promoting papakainga housing is an objective of the government, but it's still on a different basis from the infill development, which becomes a permitted activity as of right through this bill. And so there is a supplementary order paper 111 in the name of Dr. Elizabeth Kerikeri proposing to have papakainga activity as a controlled activity in a Maori purpose zone, in a residential zone, settlement zone or any other zone on each site which is wholly or partly Māori customary land, Māori freehold land or general land owned by Māori. So the planning system and plan provisions and Council's failure to adequately provide and encourage papakainga has been a significant barrier to its development. So could the Minister provide some comment on, given that the SOP doesn't go as far as enabling papakainga in the same way that it does enabling three-storey, three-unit infill development, what sort of guidance will be being provided by the Ministry for the Environment to councils as to how they will go about enabling provision of papakainga? The other issue is the comments that Simon Court made in terms of the Select Committee finding itself dealing with the detail of urban design around things like outlook space, building height to boundary, recession planes and the like. There has been quite a lot of concern that the standard that was recommended by the majority of the committee for outlook, for example, which affects interaction with neighbours, it's 4 metres between dwellings, whereas the Auckland Unitary Plan provides for a 6-metre outlook standard. Hobsonville, which is widely promoted by many as epitomising very good medium density development, has a 6-metre outlook standard. What is the proposal of government if any of these detailed standards, which the Select Committee and the Government and National have arrived at, if they are found to be wanting, what is the process to change them? And given the significant expertise which the urban design community, architects, planners and others contributed to the Select Committee process, what is going to be the government's process for developing the urban design guidelines to assist councils in terms of both the National Policy Statement for Urban Development and the MDRS? But fundamentally, what is the process for changing things that in the detail of the new Schedule 3A we may have got wrong?
I call on the Minister, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A lot of questions there, and if I omit any and the member takes another call, I'd be happy to address them. In respect of papakainga, thank you for the amendments that came through from the Select Committee, which we're adopting. Papakainga on land that is within these new zoned areas, of course, gets the benefit of the changed zonings. If there is other land that is outside of urban zones on which papakainga is to be built, then councils can include similar provisions in their plans for that. In respect of the issues as to style, we shouldn't, I don't think, in Parliament prescribe design guidelines as if we want to be the architect, and we're not. And we're not. And that's the error in the way in which it was put by Simon Court, because we're not. We're actually just permitting a certain density of housing to be built. How that's designed, whether people want to build like that, that's up to them, and if they have an architect, they're architect. We're not prescribing how that is done. That said, there has been a request that was made clear through Select Committee that some design guidance would be useful for both councils and developers. And so in response to that, the MFE, in consultation with planners from councils, will try and provide some non-statutory design guidance. We are concerned that if we were to leap to design standards that were of statutory effect, that we would actually be putting ourselves in the position of being the designer, and we don't want to do that. That said, there is probably a case for some design guidance to be given in developed in consultation with the planners who are dealing with these issues around the country. Not just the planners, also the urban design groups, civil society groups who have an interest. In addition to that, urban design guides do have a more prominent role in a lot of overseas jurisdictions where they are dealing with intensification or have been dealing with it for longer than New Zealand has been. And so we're willing to consider that issue again through the replacement of the RMA, the Natural and Built Environments Act. But we are wary of going too far too early in respect of those design guides, because we fear that they could be misused to effectively undermine the intent, which is to enable, not require, but enable intensification.
I call on David Seymour.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I think we've just seen one of the problems with this whole exercise of attempting to do urban planning on every suburban street of New Zealand from this Parliament. The Minister just said, well, I don't think it would be right for Parliament to try and do urban design from here, and he's absolutely right. So he actually does understand and accept the problem. But equally, by putting a zone prescription on every residential section in the country, and I say every because according to the Minister, all the Tier 2 cities, as he calls them, are going to be jumping up and down wanting to have this. We shall see. You know, we're going to actually have a terrible, terrible problem here, and it's this. This statute is going to put into law a medium-density residential standard that effectively says you can have a 3-storey building a metre from your boundary with no urban design standards, with a floor-to-ceiling window on the 3rd floor looking into your kid's bedroom, and there's nothing you can do about it. And, of course, the Minister might say, oh, but it's laissez-faire, everyone should support that. Well, actually, here's the thing. If you think hard about public policy, then you understand that the role of government as a regulator is to address market failures. And here's another thought. Market failures are not when a market outcome is something you don't like. Specifically, it is when the game theory outcome of people participating in a market is not Pareto optimal. This is just basic 101 stuff. And people who believe in markets and a free society often come to the conclusion that in some of those circumstances, it's actually worthwhile having a regulation. And one of those is urban design standards. Things like overlooking, things like overshadowing. And often the balance and the cost-benefit analysis of whether you need a certain level of intervention and regulation is specific to the place, to the characteristics of the location, to people and community and the provision of infrastructure in that place. Those are all the reasons why you might want to have urban design standards. That's why, for example, in Auckland, we have the Auckland Design Manual to stop 2 people doing what is best for them but getting an outcome that is actually worse for everyone. That's the simple basis for having regulations. It can actually increase overall welfare. But this statute, which puts in place this medium density residential standard, denies that opportunity to communities. And that is why it actually reduces people's overall welfare. Now, the Minister would like to say that, oh, no, it's okay, we've got 150 pages of analysis. But I asked him in the previous stage, where is the analysis that defines the problem with housing supply as being one of zoning capacity? And he couldn't do it. All he could say was, in general, it will be more efficient if people live closer together, and in general, it's going to be good to have more zone space. He couldn't answer the question of where's the analysis that it's actually going to work in Auckland, in Hamilton, in cities, in New Zealand, as we stand right now, thinking at the margin. So what he's left with is an increase in zoning capacity that may not be serviced, but if it is going to it's going to lower people's overall welfare because of the kinds of market failures, tragedy of the commons, development that goes on side by side, where people actually lower each other's quality of life. Now, actors thought a bit about this, and in particular, we have read the analysis that this bill was based on by Sense Partners and PwC. And we understand how it works, and that's what we've been explaining throughout this committee, and the Minister is either willfully ignoring it or hasn't read it. Because what that analysis said is that when in 2016 the Auckland Unitary Plan introduced the mixed housing urban and mixed housing suburban zones, there was a proportionate increase in floor area ratio in areas that were denser. And he's extrapolated that's going to keep happening here. But what's interesting is that they didn't model the medium density residential standard. That's never been modelled. Madam Chair.
Seymour.
Thank you. What they did model was mixed housing urban, and that's what they based their projections on. And they also modelled mixed housing suburban. And what that analysis says, if we just accept for a moment that there isn't actually a binding constraint of infrastructure, and that actually there is going to be a linear extrapolation of the amount of homes that get built, allowing for proximity to city centre and a few other variables they used, is that actually you don't get much less additional homes by using mixed housing suburban. That is a zone that is widely used in Auckland. It allows two homes. It allows a 3-metre high and 45-degree setback. It's one that is familiar to the planners and the processes there. And we think if the government wanted to rely on the modelling it's got, and I've given all the reasons why they shouldn't rely on that modelling, because there's a non sequitur that because you added more zoning capacity and that gave you more homes at one point in time, that will always be true at other points in time. It's simply illogical, but if we just accept that for a moment, because clearly it's going to be difficult to move the government on it, then why not use a familiar zone that is going to have less effect on other people's welfare, that, according to their own modelling, shows we'll get almost the same amount of increased housing? Now, that's got to be a good deal. You know, they could achieve some of their goal, they could get more housing, they could make it more acceptable to people who will be upset about this when they get no design standards, 3 stories, a metre from their boundary, floor-to-ceiling window on the 3rd floor looking in on their kid's bedroom. People will be upset about that. They could avoid that outcome and get more housing. Now, that's got to be a good deal. And thankfully, my ever-diligent colleague, Simon Court, has produced a fairly detailed supplementary order paper. It has amendments on supplementary order paper 107 that would replace the medium density residential standard that these guys have provided with a standard that basically replicates the mixed housing suburban zone used in Auckland. So in Auckland, it would mean that all areas that are single-family home, for example, would be upgraded to MHS. Areas that are currently MHS would stay the same. Areas that are mixed housing urban would stay the same. Areas of town centres would stay the same. Terraced housing and apartment building areas, they would all stay the same. But the net effect would be to upgrade single-family homes to mixed housing suburban. And as the government's modelling shows, that would actually give the increase of housing that they want, or very close to it, notwithstanding the other constraints in the supply chain. And it would be familiar, and it would be a lot more acceptable to people who will otherwise object. And the government should think about that. The government should think about the National Party. The National Party should think about that. It's interesting. They say, oh, it's David Seymour just stands up for his constituents. But keep saying that, by the way. Every time you guys accuse me of standing up for my constituents, they hear it, and it's helpful. So thank you. Please keep saying it. And people outside the electorate I currently represent, they hear it too. The more you guys say that, I do appreciate it, and I hope you'll keep saying it. But this amendment would increase the outlook spaces, that is the zones outside primary windows, such as the primary bedroom window. It would increase the outlook space outside secondary bedroom windows to be like the mixed housing suburban zone that is so familiar to us in Auckland. It would allow urban design considerations so that we don't end up with the kind of unfortunate circumstances where two neighbours do what they view as in their own best interest, but they end up in conflict, and they both end up worse off than they could have otherwise been. And I say all this because, the Minister likes to talk about me and my political philosophy. I don't think he understands it that well. We're engaged in making good public policy, of having the role of government restricted in a principled way to make people's lives better, to regulate genuine market failures, and to spend tax on things that are public goods that can't otherwise be produced, although that's not really relevant here. We are wary of market imperfections, about network effects of infrastructure. These are all the things that you have to do when you do public policy as a big kid. But unfortunately, the government hasn't left any time because they want to rush this through Christmas.
I call on the Minister, the Honourable David. The Honourable David Parker.
At the heart of this bill, it is pretty simple. We're not requiring people to build 3 stories, but we're letting them. And we think that Auckland and our other large centres need that in order to house people affordably. The ACT Party obviously disagrees with that, and they're free to disagree. Similar points were made in the earlier part. But that's why we won't be agreeing to the supplementary order paper that would effectively render this bill ineffective by reducing substantially. Well, according to the advice that I've got, adopting a 3 metre or 4 metre, a 3 metre boundary. Of course, I've read it. The 3 metre 45-degree recession plane would reduce the housing outcome by 31%.
I call on the Honourable Eugenie Sage.
Thank you. The Green Party won't be supporting that SOP either, because it is the mixed housing suburban rather than the urban one, and so it goes completely against getting more intensification. But the schedule in Part 2, Schedule 2, which inserts a new Schedule 3B, amends the National Policy Statement on Urban Development 2020. And would be interested in the Minister, as Minister for the Environment, as someone who has always recognised that the economy depends on the environment, why in the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, the primary objective 1 is about well-functioning urban environments that enable all people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural well-being and their health and safety now and into the future. And there is no mention of environmental well-being. And so for healthy cities where people have clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, space to exercise, get the mental well-being from being out in nature, What is the Minister's response to the SOP 114, which seeks to insert in Objective 1 of the National Policy Statement, Urban Development, a reference to environmental wellbeing as well as social and economic wellbeing? And that new Schedule 3B in the Minister's SOP inserts a number of other policies into the NPS urban development. And what the Green Party is concerned about is that there is only passing reference to nature in the existing NPS UD. It was something we brought up last term when it was being developed. And so we're seeking through this supplementary order paper a new policy that encourages an increase in urban tree cover, both through the retention of existing trees and also ensuring that there's easy public access to natural areas as well as open space. The only reference at the moment in the NPS is to having good accessibility for all people to natural spaces. There's nothing about encouraging nature within the urban environment, and yet sustainable development is all about integrating nature, not exceeding nature's capacity. So if we are not to have cities that are just hard surfaces and expanses of concrete, is the Minister considering any future amendments to the National Policy Statement for Urban Development to better recognise nature? First question. And then the other issue is there's another supplementary order paper that the Greens have in my name, 109, which is all about development bonuses for developers if they meet certain site factors, and they relate to things like water-sensitive design, an ability to have solar panels on roofs, and encouraging more energy-efficient buildings, which of course will help our housing stock reduce energy use and contribute to reduction of emissions. Development bonuses aren't something that the bill encourages, and yet the government, through Kāinga Ora, has an urban design statement, which is the Simple Guide to Urban Design and Development that Housing New Zealand put out. And it encourages, it's got a lot of principles in there about environmental design, about encouraging good stormwater management, making the best use of existing natural environments, three waters management, sustainable use of resources, things like energy efficient design. Have heard from officials that things like that are best done through the building code. We know that the building code is inadequate. This bill, with the standards for medium density in Schedule 3, makes a number of provisions about building envelopes and the like. Why? What proposals does the Minister have to use both the Resource Management Act and to encourage his colleagues around the Building Act to really improve our standards if, as my other SOPs have failed, I suspect this one will as well. But it's the principle of ensuring that our building stock is more efficient, that it doesn't increase stormwater runoff, and we had a lot of submissions to Select Committee about increased stormwater flows and houses having to have increased capacity with tanks to avoid or to mitigate the peak flows. We are doing nothing through this bill to really encourage sustainable design. We are encouraging more intensification, but not well-designed houses in terms of energy efficiency, minimising water runoff, and ensuring that there's an increased capacity for things like solar.
Order. I call on the Minister, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, the member's right that we won't be supporting that supplementary order paper, and the member addressed one of the reasons why in her own contribution. We think that the system would get very gummed up if we effectively imposed building code or building act issues relating to the quality of building materials into the planning code. If you want more energy efficient building materials as a required minimum, there are arguments for that through the building code, but we don't think that we should be imposing it through this legislation.
I call
Through this legislation.
I call on Simon Court.
Yeah. So There is a place for codifying, establishing standards. The ACT Party believes that, for example, there should be, New Zealand should adopt the building materials standards from countries which have complementary conditions, like Canada and Japan and California, for example, when it comes to rainfall and seismic. There is a place to codify the effects on the environment of development and activities. The Infrastructure Commission, in their submission to another resource management bill, the NBEA, they propose that rather than developers and contractors, infrastructure operators having to get consents for everything, that if the effects were well understood because we do this stuff every day, then rather than obtaining consents, those matters could be codified. But they also pointed out that it requires extensive consultation to make sure that the unintended or perverse consequences from hastily thought out pieces of legislation don't end up causing a whole lot of effects down the track that impose cost on business and actually reduce the overall welfare of the communities that pieces of legislation are proposing to help. And that's why the medium density residential standard, like many things this government has promoted, well-intentioned, but ultimately doomed to fail. It won't deliver the 100,000 homes, just like another policy announced by a recent Labor-led government also failed to deliver 100,000 homes. And I want to talk a little bit about the medium density residential standard. The ACT Party does not intend that we take on the role of urban designers or architects. It's actually the government that's forced us to adopt that role, because by including the medium density residential standard in primary legislation, that's the field on which we are forced to engage. So our proposal to instead replace it with what the PricewaterhouseCoopers Sense Partners cost-benefit analysis demonstrates will be just about as good, the Auckland Unitary Plan Mixed Housing Suburban Standard, people say, oh, but that's only 2 stories, and what we want is 3 stories and 3 houses on a lot. Well, Urban Auckland provided a fantastic submission where they show quite clearly that on a typical section in Auckland, 800 odd square metres, you can put 3 homes. You can achieve a couple of fantastic 2-storey great lifestyle apartment or terrace units, 82 square metres each, and a standalone 2-storey home with a separate garage, 173 square metres. That's a very large home by any standard. And that's under the mixed housing suburban standard. So what that demonstrates actually is that the medium density residential standard, it's not just unnecessary, it's not just complex, it doesn't just introduce a whole lot of unnecessary impacts on people's lifestyle and well-being and ultimate welfare. It doesn't have to force the stripping of all the vegetation and trees, as my colleague and the committee chair, Honourable Eugenie Sage, pointed out. It actually allows the retention of significant green spaces and trees, outdoor living, sunlight, views that the medium density residential standard does not. So that's why ACT advocates to incorporate essentially the Auckland Unitary Plan Mixed Housing Suburban Standard in the Schedule 1 to replace the MDRS. And while the ACT Party can't support blanket tree protection, we do recognise that there are significant environmental benefits from having a certain amount of permeable surfaces, landscaped areas. These things all add to the well-being of the people who live in these homes and communities. And that is why, as a recovering civil engineer, I've had to take on the role of urban designer, advocate for architects, and that's not a role I ever expected, or in fact any Member of Parliament should have to, but that is what the Minister is asking from us through this bill. And that is why ACT is advocating very strongly for the mixed housing suburban standard to replace the government's standard.
Mr. Chairman. The Honourable David Parker.
I repeat, the reason why we won't be adopting that is it would effectively frustrate the purpose of the bill substantially by reducing the number of building opportunities by more than 30%, and we think that that would not be as good an outcome.
David Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's a very interesting answer that's well worth getting some more detail from the Minister, if indeed he can provide it, and we always hold out hope. The Minister has said that introducing the mixed housing suburban standard in lieu of the medium density residential standard would reduce the anticipated yield of housing of additional housing, that is, by 31%. So, you know, I'm no mathematical expert, but that seems to me that the mixed housing suburban proposal that Simon Court's put up as amendments on supplementary order paper number 107 would actually increase housing by 69%. You know, that's a 69% additional housing, if we get that right. Now, of course, he might argue that not all of the extra housing we expect will come from this bill. I guess another way he might put it is that he's going to get 69% of what he's promised. And then you ask, well, you know, what he's promised is actually just a modelled outcome that made an assumption that increasing zoning intensity would yield more floor area ratio at the same rate that the upzoning of the AUP yielded in 2016, which, as we've said many times and the Minister's never answered, is a highly questionable assumption. Now, you know, I just wonder if the Minister, why he wouldn't be happy with 69% increase if it also was more acceptable to neighbours, to councils, more familiar, would actually lead to higher quality urban environments of the type that the Green members referred to. The Hobsonville Point development has some similar features to what this amendment produces, such as the 6-metre outlook space outside principal windows. So why wouldn't the Minister want that? And here's the next question for him. What sort of analysis is he relying on when he says that it would only be 69% as good as mixed housing urban? You know, what's he relying on there? It's just purely the extrapolation from what happened in the AUP. It's got nothing to do with what might happen in the present time. So if he can explain that, then he can explain what cost-benefit analysis he's done with other costs, such as shading of neighbours and overlooking of neighbours and the undermining of urban design standards that are actually part of the government's own policies and part of Kāinga Ora's policies for another thing. You know, can he explain how the government chose between the mixed housing urban standard at one level and the mixed housing suburban standard at another level, because they modelled the increase in housing from both of them. So can he explain why he believes that the costs of going to MHU instead of MHS would be greater? And if he can explain why the mixed housing urban zone would be better on a full cost-benefit analysis than the mixed housing suburban zone on a full cost-benefit analysis, then perhaps he could explain why he didn't use the mixed housing urban zone. Because if he can explain that, then I guess the answer is actually we should amend the bill not to use the medium density residential zone but the mixed housing urban. But first he's got to explain 31% less than what? Is he saying that the mixed housing suburban will be 31% less than mixed housing urban, or less than MDRS? And once he's explained which one it is, what other cost-benefit analysis is he relying on to say that actually the MHS wouldn't give greater overall benefits, including extra housing and better urban amenity for people that want to live in these houses he'd like to see built?
Madam Chair.
The Honourable David Parker.
The urban Auckland modelling that the member relies on used a site size of 843 square metres. The sites that are predominant in Auckland are, of course, much smaller than that on average. The analysis that was done in the bill, as was presented to the Select Committee, was based on site sizes of 412 square metres. The additional analysis that the Select Committee then requested was what would be the effect on the housing provided as modelled when it went into Select Committee compared with the change to those height to boundary rules, but still in respect of a 412 square metre site. And that analysis was that if the height to boundary rules changed to 3 metres and a 45-degree recession plane, there would be a substantial unwinding of the intention of this, which is to enable the sort of intensification that is already occurring in some parts of cities, some parts of Wellington, some parts of Auckland, but is unable to occur because the choices of landowners are hobbled by restrictive planning rules that do not allow those densities to be built in those areas. I think the language that the National Party uses in respect of this is quite fair, and I'm surprised that I haven't heard any of this from the ACT Party. They say that at one level this bill is giving choice to landowners to develop their properties to a 3-storied with smaller housing units in order to sometimes accommodate an ageing parent or someone who's disabled, or just because they want to cut off the back of their section and get a bit of money in retirement whilst enabling someone else to build a house there and live in it. It's not a radical bill. It's an effective bill to address the housing crisis by increasing the opportunities to build houses that have a smaller footprint and a smaller land cost. No one's forced to build them, we're just enabling it.
Eugenie.
I move that the question be now put.
I'm tempted, but I'll go with Simon Court, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to come to another matter, and we're actually circling back to the provisions relating to partly completed proposed plans. And so, while we understand that the Minister is not prepared to move on the medium density residential standards, even though it appears that there is no updated cost-benefit analysis for the claims that he has made today, that was asked for at Select Committee this week, and we still haven't seen the analysis, although the results of the analysis have been reported in the media as being only a reduction of 3 to 4% from the government's initial proposal of a 6-metre high wall. Now it's a 4-metre high wall, 1 metre from the boundary. But there is another matter which we've covered to some extent, but which is still important and needs to be exposed. And that is that for private plan changes, and we're talking about developers like the Templeton Group, which have, through one of the companies they acquired, Todd Properties, developed Stonefields in Auckland, a former quarry site, into one of the most exquisite master plan developments, a combination of apartment living, terraced housing and single homes. It's a balance of intensification, of lifestyles and opportunities for people to at the time that the development was first offered off the plans, to buy affordable homes close to transportation networks, close to amenities. That's a site that was at one point tasked with being Auckland's future regional landfill in the 1990s. That instead was repurposed to an extremely high quality master plan development. So it shows you that if we trust the private sector to actually deliver homes and communities they will deliver much better outcomes than a regional landfill in an old quarry pit. They will deliver some of the best master plan developments anywhere in the world. And the evidence from that group, the Templeton group, from the Adair developers in Hamilton, from Beachlands South Consortium, which also includes the New Zealand Super Fund as a large part of the consortium, an organisation which, while it can't speak for itself because it is essentially not able to, because it's a government entity, what they have asked for is for their private plan change proposals, which set out the most exquisite community developments, intensity, apartments, terraced housing around retail and community centres, and of course single homes around the margins. And as they pointed out, those single homes actually, the single home zones, which essentially comply with the standards of the mixed housing suburban, quite large homes and additional dwellings on these properties, they fit in with the natural environment in those parts of these master plan sites which are more sensitive, which are closer to streams and waterways, closer to existing remnant bush areas, for example, where the developers and iwi and their ecology advisors all agree it would be highly inappropriate to locate buildings at the scale and size that the medium density residential standard proposes. And that is why I have today tabled a further supplementary order paper proposing to replace Part 4 in Schedule 3 with a new Part 4, which essentially, if the Minister intends that local councils should be forced to include the medium density residential standard in their plan changes, well, what private developers are asking for, particularly those ones who have delivered the most exquisite, high quality and desirable developments New Zealand's ever seen in the past 30 years, who have a pipeline of $8 billion worth of work, some of them, and billions of dollars worth others. Mr Chair.
Simon Court.
Thank you, Mr Chair. What they are asking for is just a blanket exemption. They've said the years and years of investment in technical investigations, in ecology reports, finding out when the bats come and go from the remnant bush on their development sites. They don't want all of that to be wasted when they have to redesign and remodel their developments to accept these three-storey, three-unit boxes on these what are currently designed for single home sites. The planning consultants who spoke to the committee also pointed out that when they're designing these developments, what they design for, the infrastructure accommodates much higher intensity and density at the centre, around the town centres, along transport corridors. Kind of sounds like urban planning to me. That's what they do, and they do it really well. They've said that the pipes are much larger. The wastewater pump stations are more frequent and have to be larger, that the stormwater detention ponds and all those other environmental mitigations are designed for density at the centre, low density at the margins of these developments, because that's what good urban design practice has evolved into over the past 50 or so years since World War II. Since New Zealanders returning from World War II had the opportunity to buy a piece of quarter-acre paradise, and then those New Zealanders who, and new New Zealanders who moved to cities like Auckland in the 1990s, who wanted to live in more dense communities, subdivided existing eighth of acres or quarter acres and put an extra house or a couple of houses on the back. Actually, all of that can be delivered in a far more planned and high quality way through accepting that there is a good urban design set of principles and that the master planners delivering projects like at Peacock and Hamilton East, the Adair Group, that the Beachlands South developers, in Breachlands Maraetai, where they propose that their higher densities are much closer to the ferry terminal, to public transport and to nearby schools. They don't consider it's appropriate to have much higher densities much further from the town centres. They understood, having studied urban design and planning for decades, actually you want to build up closer to where you've got social services, community services, transportation, and where your bulk infrastructure is located. And the reason they're asking for an exemption is not just because they're confident that they can do it better than the government, which by any analysis, whether it's a cost-benefit analysis that we haven't seen yet or that they could, what they're asking for is an exemption to be allowed to continue to proceed with the high-quality developments that are in train. And as I pointed out earlier this morning, it takes a long time and a significant cost and investment of resources, technical expertise, even to get to the pre-lodgement stage with private plan changes. What people outside this House might know as a change of zoning, right, from say rural land or a bit of rural and a bit of residential, combine all of those titles and land types into one larger block of land, design a new community around the existing environment, the remnant bush, the streams and waterways that are there, and actually deliver some of the best quality of life that New Zealanders everywhere would aspire to. And this bill would extinguish those developments, actually extinguish them. And this is from a government which keeps talking about well-being, which has all kinds of well-being measures, although we never actually see the measurement. They don't actually want to report any of those well-beings, but we know they believe in well-being, or they certainly did once. That is why the ACT Party proposes in this supplementary order paper, labelled A, and it's on the table, it's very simple. It says if the Minister wants to impose this flawed medium-density residential standard on local councils, well, that's up to him to negotiate. But what the ACT Party is seeking actually just completely exempt private plan changes, master plan developments, the private sector from this flawed approach to urban planning and design. Because New Zealanders do aspire to live in high-quality homes in wonderful communities where their well-being is put first. So does the ACT Party.
Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Parker.
We're not extinguishing one development, not one. So the member need not to be concerned about that. In respect of master plan developments, we're not requiring them to be built in any particular way. They can build them however they want, this, subject to the existing rules that councils apply. All this legislation does is enable the underlying zoning to enable densification.
I call Sarah Palmer.
Mr. Chair, I move that the question be now put.
The question is that the question be now put. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party vote has been called for. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand Labour.
65 votes in favour.
New Zealand National.
33 votes in favour.
Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand.
10 votes in favour.
ACT New Zealand.
10 votes opposed.
Te Pāti Māori.